All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope you all had a good Independence Day. You celebrated with friends or family. Um, I had a pretty nice break, almost a full week. Um, Actually, no, it was a full week. Today's Thursday. Um, didn't really know what to do with myself some nights, but that was the plan. So anyway. We are back for, I believe we're on chapter 7, yep, of Problem of Slavery in Western Culture. So, we're just going to jump right on into it. If you've been watching, you know I've got to wear cheaters for this. The type is just so stinking small. I cannot read it with my getting older eyes. So, I'm going to just sit back here and dive right on in. Chapter 7: The Legitimacy of Enslavement and the Ideal of the Christian Servant, the Failure of Christianization. In 1698, Germain Fromageau, who presided at the tribunal for the cases of conscience at the Sorbonne, wow. Ruled that any buyer of a slave must make certain that his property was originally acquired by legitimate means, conceding that slavery was permitted by the Bible, the canon law, and the Jus Gentium. Fromageau went on to observe that Negroes were commonly enslaved by fraud or tyrannical laws. The opinion, which was essentially the same as the one which brought José de Bologna's expulsion from Bahia, was reported to have caused sharp discontent in the French colonies. Curiously enough, similar scruples were expressed in Puritan Massachusetts, a fact which shows the persistence in Christianity both Catholic and Protestant, of the ancient legalistic distinction between lawful captives and the victims of unjust violence. The slavery of the former was authorized in 1641 by the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, but 4 years later, when a New England ship returned from Africa with 2 slaves, a legal squabble between the captain and mate brought out the fact that the Yankees had seized the Negroes by treachery and violence. Fearing divine retribution, the Puritan authorities extended their jurisdiction to acts committed on the coast of Africa and ordered the arrest of both captain and mate. It was solemnly determined that the 2 Negroes should be returned to their native land. But while Protestant theologians condemned treachery, deceit, and man-stealing, their views on the legitimacy of slavery were necessarily colored by traditional Christian doctrine and by their direct experience, which was generally more limited than that of Catholics in Iberia and Latin America, with various forms of servitude. In England, the controversies beginning in the 1660s over kidnapping children and other defenseless people for shipment as servants to America may have led to a greater awareness of unscrupulous modes of procuring slaves. But the increase in convicts transported to America may also have fortified the belief that many African slaves had been similarly spared a deserved punishment of death. William Ames, whom the Puritans looked to as a seminal thinker, had doubted whether a master could hold an innocent servant in absolute bondage without violating the Golden Rule, but even he had admitted that a crime deserving death might be legitimately punished by perpetual slavery. In general, British theologians accepted the traditional Christian dualisms regarding slavery, which they tended to associate with milder forms of domestic servitude and with the Hebrew bondage of the Old Testament. William Perkins and Samuel Willard, who may be taken as representative of English and American Puritanism, agreed that Aristotle had been wrong in thinking of slavery as a product of nature. According to Willard, the pagan philosophers had been ignorant of had been ignorant of man's primitive state of perfection and had erroneously identified the law of nature with what they observed in the sinful world. Since all bondage had arisen from man's universal corruption, and since all men owed their primary allegiance to God, no master could claim the right of absolute dominion, and no servant could forfeit his entire liberty. On this crucial point of limiting all worldly power, the Puritans were at one point with Robert Sanderson, a conservative Anglican, who maintained that we, quote, must not acknowledge any our supreme master, nor yield ourselves to be wholly and absolutely ruled by the will of any, but only Christ our Lord and Master in heaven, end quote. Okay. William Ames, like Epictetus, feared that perfect servitude would corrupt a master. Perkins held that the institution of slavery, were established by positive law, might, quote, stand with good conscience if it be used with moderation, end quote. But no master had the right to separate families, to command what was forbidden by God, or even to bind servants, quote, to perpetual slavery and never make them free, end quote. Willard said a master must recognize that the soul of his slave was worth as much as his own, and forbear from cruel punishments, quote, scurrilous and undue threatenings, end quote, or from giving his servants scornful titles as if they were creatures of another species. But this preference for limited servitude and for charitable relations between master and slave was more than offset by a fear that the wrong kind of liberty would lead to a forgetfulness of sin and to an overturning of the social order. William Gouge, attacking what he took to be the Anabaptist position that all men are equal and that bond service was contrary to nature, said the servant must acquiesce even in unjust beatings in the knowledge that he would ultimately be vindicated by divine justice. Sanderson was similarly outraged by the Anabaptist view of Christian liberty. Quote, as if Christ or his apostle had any purpose to slacken those sinews and ligaments, and to dissolve those joints and contignations which tie into one body those many little members and parts whereof all human societies consist. End quote. Perkins assured his readers that in this life Christian liberty extended only to the spirit. Ames conceded that it was legitimate for a servant to accept total bondage out of necessity. Willard explained that though slavery had been brought into the world by sin, quote unquote right reason showed that the institution was a proper part of the worldly orders of subjection and authority, as well as being profitable and beneficial to mankind. Gabriel Towerson was not even pleased by the gradual abolition of slavery in Europe, since, quote, it was neither founded upon any good reason, nor hath proved much for the convenience of the world, end quote. Discussing the Decalogue in 1676, Towerson pointed out that there were many poor men, quote, not unlike to certain beasts, end quote, who could not govern themselves. Slavery would give such a man subsistence and would restrain him from, quote, those exorbitances to which either his ignorance or his pravity of his nature may incline him, end quote. And while Towerson would hold masters responsible for providing adequate food and clothing, he told servants that their work was done for God, who had assigned them to their lowly position. Associating slavery with the image of a stable Christian household ruled by the Bible and right reason, these British Protestants exhorted all bondsmen to revere their masters and to be patient, obedient, and diligent. If a servant were allowed to question his fate, he would undermine the very foundation of social order. We have, then, a view of bondage as a reciprocal relationship between loving master and loyal servant, instituted by God for the better ordering of a sinful world, but limited by the rational terms of the social covenant. George Fitzhugh, the most extreme of Southern apologists, would see slavery in the 19th century as the ideal form of social order and as the universal bulwark against anarchy. William Lloyd Garrison would conclude that government and law, as well as slavery, were sinful infringements upon Christian liberty. But in the 17th century, when there were few hints of this future bifurcation, servitude appeared to balance natural freedom and worldly fate, human authority and the equality of men under the supreme rule of God. Despite a tendency to use the infidelity of Negroes as an excuse for the African trade, Protestant thinkers were usually as wary as their Catholic counterparts in considering the legality of original enslavement. Human bondage they pictured not so much as a righteous punishment as a model of man's dependence on higher authority by concentrating on the idealized picture of a dutiful servant in a Christian family. It was relatively easy to ignore the violence that produced America's slaves. Okay, is everything good? Okay, we're good. It is true that a few Protestant writers continued to raise embarrassing questions. In 1637, the Protestant Synod at Rouen felt it necessary to cite the law of nations in replying to, quote, over-scrupulous persons who thought it unlawful for Protestant merchants to deal in slaves, end quote. In 1704, Jacques Bernard, a Huguenot refugee in Holland analyzed the recently published account of the Guinea trade by William Bosman, a Dutch factor, and found support for his earlier belief in an eternal contradiction between slaveholding and the Golden Rule. A Lutheran divine, Johann Buddeus, I don't know, Buddeus, asserted that even if some Negroes had been legally captured or convicted of crime, their children should not inherit the penalty of bondage. But this later objection could be met by the argument of Gabriel Towerson, Samuel Puffendorf, and the great jurist Johann Heinesius, that some men were by nature incapable of maintaining or governing themselves. Sorry, I got to sound out some of those names sometimes. Hence, Cotton Mather told Negroes in Massachusetts that they should give up their quote-unquote fondness for freedom and recognize that as slaves they lived better than they would as free men. A number of British writers claimed that the Negro slave, whose quote-unquote moderate labor was unaccompanied by the wretched insecurity of the English lower class, enjoyed quote, a state of comparative felicity, end quote, and that at any rate, quote, men in savage life have no incentive to emulation. Persuasion is lost on such men, and compulsion to a certain degree is humanity and charity, end quote. When a young squire from Dorset was confronted for the first time with the West Indian slave market, he soothed his conscience by reflecting that, quote, surely God ordained 'em for the use and benefit of us, otherwise his divine will would have been made manifest by some particular sign or token, end quote. And as an absentee planter, and the same squire later did his best to reinforce the image of a happy Negro peasantry. He instructed his manager to point out to visitors how much better the slaves lived than the poor in England, and to keep such guests at all times away from the sound of the whip. Regardless, when the justice of original enslavement Regardless, then, of the justice of original enslavement, American slavery in its functions and blessings furnished its own vindication. American slaveholders, even in Jamaica, took comfort in the thought that they simply received their bond servants from others and bore no moral responsibility for what might have happened in Africa or on the high seas. In 1788, indeed, a committee of the Jamaican Assembly had the audacity to state that the slave trade was purely a British affair for which West Indians bore no responsibility. But this dissociation of American slavery from the legitimacy of African enslavement, while giving planters a sense of moral security, left the foundations of the system highly vulnerable to attack. To make American slavery conform to the ancient Christian ideal of servitude not only meant that Negroes should be baptized and instructed in the faith, but that they should be brought to internalize the precepts of humility, patience, and willing obedience, which would allow masters to rule by love instead of force. But how was this to be done? Jean-Baptiste de Tertre thought Negroes in the West Indies confirmed Plato's observation that God had deprived slaves of half their reason in order to keep them from reflecting upon their wrongs. The missionary noted that the Negroes were light-hearted and apparently oblivious of their suffering, yet their arrogant, unpredictable temper obliged masters to punish them for the least fault. What if religious instruction succeeded in restoring that part of reason which understood injustice, but failed to replace pagan boldness with Christian humility? Duterte skirted around this question and concluded that missionaries at least provided slaves with the only protection they would receive. Quote, if interest alone were ever to rule in the islands, it is certain there would no longer be any relief. End quote. He saw little value in the perfunctory baptisms that the Portuguese gave their Negroes before shipment to Africa. To Africa. Okay. But above all, he held up for scorn the British and Dutch planters who, following a principle of their quote, so-called Reformation, end quote, that prohibited Christians from holding their brethren in captivity, refused even to baptize their slaves. Dutertre pointed to a fundamental difference between the Catholic and Protestant churches, which was bound to affect their relationship with American slavery. Catholics might be very slow in providing slaves with meaningful religious lives and might long discriminate against even freedmen of the prescribed race, but in time the Catholic emphasis on universality would remove most of the distinctions that barred the descendants of slaves from spiritual equality. The relative exclusiveness of the Protestants, which was associated with their emphasis on individual responsibility, presented an additional barrier to the Christianization of Negro bondage. Nevertheless, Dutertre's challenge was taken up by a number of eminent British Protestants, and most notable of whom were Richard Baxter and Morgan Godwin. Although Baxter praised rulers who enacted laws making baptism equivalent to emancipation, because this might induce infidels to seek Christianity, he adhered to the traditional view that faith affected the soul rather than external condition. Accordingly, he told servants to, quote, reverence that providence of God which calleth you to a servant's life, and murmur not at your labor or your low condition, but know your mercies and be thankful for them. End quote. Masters, on the other hand, held their power as Christ's trustees and were obliged to lead even Negro slaves towards a Christian life, or risk being convicted of open rebellion against God. Godwin, who had lived for a time in Virginia and Barbados, was even more emphatic in defending the compatibility of slavery and Christianity. Quote, it, Christianity, establisheth the authority of masters over their servants and slaves, in as high a measure as even themselves could have prescribed, exacting the strictest fidelity, requiring service with singleness of heart, as unto the Lord, and not unto men, and so far it is from encouraging resistance that it allows them not the liberty of gainsaying or making undutiful replies to their masters, and referring them to future recompense in heaven for their faithful services done to them upon earth. End quote. In addition to making slaves better workers, Christianity was the best security against disloyalty and insurrection, nor was there any ground for the belief that baptism entailed liberation. Abraham's slaves had not been freed by circumcision. Onesimus had not been freed by baptism, except in the sense that counted most, for as a Christian he was free from the law of Judaism, free from the lusts of the flesh, and free to serve Christ, which was the most perfect freedom of all. About 1680 Godwin had heard on good authority that the late Lord Chancellor had once declared he knew of no law in England whereby baptism would release a slave from service. Quote, and certainly he, if any man, must have known it. End quote. Colonists, therefore, had no excuse for withholding religion from their slaves. If there were any laws originally enacted to make Christianity more appealing, which might be construed as prejudicial to slavery, this danger could easily be removed by legislative authority, and if colonists were uncertain of the validity of their own laws, they could appeal to the king and parliament without being bound by, quote, that over-proud fear of thereby acknowledging what they cannot possibly avoid, their dependence upon England. End quote. In any event, American masters could enjoy clear consciences only if they knew they had not condemned their Negroes to an eternal slavery in hell. In 1680, Godwin offered a fairly comprehensive plan for the Christianization of American slaves. Anglican ministers sent out to the colonies should be economically independent of their planter parishioners and should be duly rewarded upon their return to England. Unswayed by colonial prejudice, they would have the power to protect Negroes from Sunday labor, restrain them from polygamy, and force masters to allow religious instruction. Masters, of course, did not look kindly upon such meddling proposals, nor were they convinced that slaves would correctly understand the subtleties of Christian liberty. In the 1630s, the Puritan officials of Old Providence Island had rebuked Samuel Rishworth for preaching to Negro slaves. In 1680, the very year Godwin wrote, the Crown's Committee of Trade and Plantations, having heard some Barbadians argue that the chief security of their island lay in keeping the Negroes ignorant and separated by a diversity of languages, decided to leave the question of religion to the colonists. Edward Long, the 18th century Jamaican historian, explained that the planters would be delighted to have their Negroes Christianized if this was practicable. But even Portuguese missionaries had found that Africans had no relish for a religion inculcating precepts of honesty, self-denial, and sexual abstinence, and had to content themselves with meaningless collective baptisms. Negroes might look with awe at the mummery and superstitious ceremonies of the Catholics. Long conceded that on the French islands an authoritarian religion reinforced state policy and helped to keep bondsmen in quote unquote peaceable subjection. Slaves were aroused, of course, by quote those systems which are set off with abundance of enthusiastic rant and gesticulation, such as Quakerism, Methodism, and the Moravian rites. End quote. But the Church of England, being founded on principles of reason and liberty, was hardly suited for Negro slaves. Yet even in the French West Indies, the status of baptized Negroes was not settled definitely until 1685, and until 1709 there was confusion on the matter in Canada. The Code Noir of 1685, which was strongly influenced by canon law, came close to Godwin's ideal, with the important exception of excluding Godwin's religion from the French islands. Though Negroes were defined as chattels, they were to be baptized and instructed in the true faith, and were not to work on Sundays or religious holidays. But French planters stubbornly resisted the enforcement of these provisions, believing, as did the Barbadians, that their only protection lay in the Negro's ignorance. An entire century passed after the enactment of the Code Noir before plantation attorneys were required to keep records of Negro births and deaths. Appeals for the Christianization of American slaves raised two problems which were frequently intertwined, but which were ultimately the product of a growing incompatibility between chattel slavery and two quite separate traditions of liberty. In spite of an ancient precedent for Godwin's opinion that baptism did not free a slave, there was an equally ancient tradition that no Christian could validly be held in a state of bondage that interfered with his performance of religious duties. As Protestants like William Ames and William Perkins expanded the limits of religious obligation, there was an increasing conflict between slavery and the ideal of Christian service. In addition, as we have already seen, there was a striking discrepancy between colonial slavery and the civil freedom which had become identified with the very soil of England and France. While the concept of chattel slavery had been accepted by medieval jurists and had persisted in law as a form of labor discipline as late as the 16th century, the actual condition of English villeins had been greatly ameliorated before the discovery of America. The continuing resistance and open rebellion of peasants, the extension of municipal liberties, the appeals to common law and Magna Carta, and most of all the disintegration of the manorial economy had constantly widened the gap between the basic rights which Englishmen took for granted and the total bondage still sanctioned by the laws of nations. Sir Edward Coke was reported to have ruled that infidels, being perpetual enemies, might legitimately be enslaved by Christians. This was, of course, the position of the Catholic Church, and was endorsed by such authorities as Christian Thomasius, a disciple of Puffendorf and a professor at Halle. As there appeared to be no basis for chattel slavery in English common law, 17th century courts upheld the rights of owners to claim Negroes as property, that is, to maintain an action of trover, by citing the fact that the Negro's infidelity, and by appealing to the common practice of merchants whose trade in slaves was presumably sanctioned by the jus gentium. In Chambers versus Workhouse, 1693, for example, Negroes were termed merchandise and compared with musk cats and monkeys. In Gelly versus Cleve, 1694, it was decided that Trover would lie for a Negro boy because he was a heathen. In 1706, however, in Smith versus Gould, Chief Justice John Holt ruled that Trover would not lie for a Negro after hearing arguments that in common law no man could have property in another except in the special cases of villanage, and that the law took no notice of Negroes being different from other men. In Smith versus Brown and Cooper, date uncertain, Holt was reported to have said that a Negro became free as soon as he came into England. And what if a Negro became a Christian and lived under the jurisdiction of the common law? The problem of the effects of baptism arose in the case of Chamberlain versus Harvey, 1696 and 7, but the point was left without decision. A number of other judicial cases added to the complexity of the problem until 1729. The Attorney General and Solicitor General gave their formal opinions that baptism could not alter the temporal condition of a slave within the British kingdoms, and that a slave was not freed by the mere fact of being brought into England. The judgment was accepted by a writer in Gentleman's Magazine who had been under the erroneous impression that any slave who set foot in England, France, Spain, Portugal, Holland, or Denmark was automatically free. England was filled, he said, with, quote, daring, dogmatizing people, end quote, who were continually preaching about liberty and the natural rights of mankind, and maintaining that, quote, to have any hand in bringing any of the human species into bondage is justly execrable, and that all who partake in the sweets of liberty should spare for no cost to procure the same for the rest of mankind everywhere, end quote. But when one mentioned the African trade to these people, they were struck dumb. Who among the boldest partisans of liberty, quote, hath once publicly opened his mouth before the court or anywhere else on the subject of the slave trade, or so much as attempted in any printed sermon, speech, or pamphlet to consider the justice or legality of it, end quote. It was certainly true that the Church of England overlooked whatever incompatibility there might have been between Negro slavery and English notions of liberty. Godwin's thesis that Christianity posed no threat to the slaveholder was taken up in 1711 by William Fleetwood, Bishop of St. Asaph, in a sermon delivered before the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. In 1727, the Bishop of London told American masters that conversion would place their slaves, quote, under stronger obligations to perform those duties with the greatest diligence and fidelity, not only from the fear of men, but from a sense of duty to God." End quote. Nor would baptism have the slightest effect on the outward condition of slaves. Quote, "The freedom which Christianity gives is a freedom from the bondage of sin and Satan, and from the dominion of men's lusts and passions and inordinate desires." End quote. The colonists, however, had not waited for these classical reassurances, but beginning with Maryland in 1664, had enacted laws stating that baptism did not free a slave. Perhaps the last colony to take such a precaution was, of all places, Prince Edward Island, the Canadian Maritime Province, whose legislature ruled in 1781 that, quote, "all Negro and mulatto servants," end quote, then on the island or afterward imported should be slaves, and that baptism should have no effect on their status. Yet the continuing insistence of such legislation revealed a deep-seated doubt which was to remain the greatest obstacle to the Christianization of Anglo-American slavery, and the growing contradiction between colonial slavery and British ideals of liberty was exposed with unconscious irony by the Englishmen of 1760s who complained that Negroes in the London area, quote, "ceased to consider themselves as slaves in this free country, nor more willingly perform the laborious offices of servitude than our own people, and, if put to do it, are generally sullen, spiteful, treacherous, and vengeful." End quote. Morgan Godwin had foreshadowed a mood and concern which would stir the Church of England at the beginning of the 18th century and give birth to a number of ambitious programs for the Christianization of American slavery. We cannot discuss this rising missionary movement in detail, but may note that it was in part a direct response to the sudden burgeoning of the African trade. 6 years after Parliament had opened the slave trade to independent merchants, Gilbert Burnet, Bishop of Sarum, reflected that if Britain were to receive so much wealth from the labor of Negroes, the least she could do in return was to save their souls. But this direct response, which evidenced a slightly uneasy state of conscience, drew upon a more general impulse to Christianize the social order that blended British traditions of philanthropy with a kind of benevolistic pietism whose influence extended from Germany to Massachusetts. During the 17th century, the wealthy classes of Britain, particularly the rising mercantile aristocracy, had increasingly identified a pious life with munificent gifts or bequests designed to improve the condition of the poor or to promote religion, education, or public health. Though mostly directed toward local problems of poverty and social disorganization, these benefactions had included funds for the redemption of Englishmen enslaved by Barbary corsairs. By the early 18th century, a new spirit of religious tolerance and cosmopolitanism induced philanthropists to look beyond the needs of their countrymen and also to borrow from the thought or practice of foreign reformers. If German pietists such as Philip Jacob Spener were inspired partly by British Protestantism, the debt was repaid when the German home mission movements and the celebrated orphan house at Hale made a profound impression on the English-speaking world. Cotton Mather eagerly read the, quote, "the devout Spener," on, quote, "the distinguishing acts of true, real, vital piety," end quote, and corresponded with August Hermann Frank. The Germans' interest in the Germans' interest in reforming society through groups of quote-unquote earnest Christians was echoed in Massachusetts by Mather's Societies for the Suppression of Disorders and by his Essays to Do Good, which exhorted masters to treat servants, quote, "in some sense end quote, like their own children, and which animated the young Benjamin Franklin with a zeal for good works. A familiar frame of mind can be seen in Thomas Bray, who was one of the founders of the Anglican Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, and whose experience in Maryland as commissioner for the Bishop of London led directly in 1701 to the formation of the SPG. Interested in all branches of missionary work, Bray was pleased to encounter in Holland one Abel Tassin sur Dallon, who contributed £900 for the aid and instruction of American Negroes. This fund, supplemented by a bequest intended to support a school for Negro children and those parents who were inclinable to Christianity, was administered after 1723 by another organization. Quote unquote, Dr. Bray's Associates. Excuse me. Whose members were soon to play a dual role as trustees for the colony of Georgia. Meanwhile, the sympathy of Englishmen had been aroused by the plight of Protestant émigrés from Germany and by the efforts of a godson of Spener's, Count Ludwig Zinzendorf, to build a refuge on his estates for the persecuted Moravian brethren. Zinzendorf sent a group of his Moravians to Georgia, and on the westward voyage their piety and serene faith made the deepest impression on a fellow traveler, a young SPG missionary named John Wesley. Even by 1732, the Moravians had acted upon their conviction that it was a positive duty to convert all heathen to Christianity, and had sent out missionaries from their isolated asylum at Herrnhut. Within a few decades, these brave representatives of a sect that had been nearly exterminated during the 30 Years' War would be preaching the Word of God to Negroes both in the West Indies and on the North American continent. It is perhaps not remarkable that a tradition of persecution should make men concerned with at least the spiritual fate of slaves. The first missionaries of the SPG to work for the conversion of Negroes, Elias Noy and Francis Lejeune, were former Huguenots. A generation later, when George Whitefield tried unsuccessfully to establish a Negro school in Pennsylvania, his chief supporters were Gilbert Tennant, an evangelical leader of the Great Awakening, John Stephen Benezet, a former Huguenot refugee, and Benjamin Franklin. Benezet, as a Quaker convert, provides a link with another minority sect whose traditions of persecution and resistance to absolute power were similar to those of the Huguenots and the Moravians. For 3 years after the Conventicle Act of 1664, English Quakers were themselves threatened with the punishment of being shipped to America as temporary slaves, and some members of the society were still in prison in 1671 when George Fox told the Negroes in Barbados that Christ had also died for them. We must postpone a fuller discussion of Quakerism to a later chapter, but it should be noted that Friends provided English Protestants with the first examples of evangelizing Negro slaves. Morgan Godwin had been a violent anti-Quaker, but he had also witnessed the activities of George Fox in Barbados. Quaker missionary efforts were severely shaken when William Edmondson's programs for the religious instruction of slaves raised a storm of protest in Barbados and resulted in 1676 and 1680 in harsh restrictive laws. In later years, as the Society of Friends won acceptance as a dissenting sect, it tended to lose its original missionary zeal, but the precedents remained. Hello. The missionary movements backed by the SPG and Bray's Associates could draw on resources that dwarfed those of Quakers and Moravians, officially supported by the Church of England. These philanthropists could also count on the cooperation of the government, which regularly sent instructions to colonial governors asking them to encourage the conversion of Indians and Negroes and to seek laws protecting slaves from inhumane cruelty. Throughout the parishes of England, men were becoming more concerned with the spiritual life of white colonists as well as of pagans, and contributed freely to support missionaries, schools, and the distribution of Bibles and religious tracts. But even if American colonists had welcomed it, there were insuperable obstacles to the mass conversion of Negro slaves. At a time when the majority of the British poor was without church or minister, and when colonial planters were dispersed over immense areas, living often beyond the reach of organized religion or communal discipline, it was quite out of the question to bring a meaningful Christian life to hundreds of thousands of slaves, and the sheer physical difficulties of numbers and distances were more than equaled by the problem of communicating with men of a radically different culture, whose knowledge of English was at best imperfect, and who were shrewd enough to suspect, as the Reverend James Blair admitted, that pronouncements that baptism did not bring emancipation were part of a colonial conspiracy to block the benign intentions of the English king. Blair went on to say that when Negroes had misconstrued the sincere efforts of missionaries, it had been necessary to hang a few troublemakers who had rebelled against the view that Christianity brought no change in status. But the greatest obstacle lay in the indifference or open hostility of the American colonists. Missionaries and catechists assured planters that Christian Negroes would be more loyal and diligent. They often required their new converts to promise, before being baptized, not to seek freedom. Yet most slaveholders were unconvinced and were quick to blame disturbances or insurrections on ministers who had allegedly filled the minds of slaves with dangerous notions of liberty. And quite apart from the fear that religion would awaken a yearning for freedom, most planters were unwilling to allow religious instruction to break the continuity of the working week, even for children. Those Negroes who were not required to labor in gangs on Sunday were usually expected in Pennsylvania, as well as in the West Indies, to spend a day tending their own provision gardens. The entire routine of the semi-autonomous plantation might be upset by the arrival of an itinerant minister, whose presence would be especially unwelcome if he happened to represent a denomination alien to the surrounding country. Religious rivalry made even so ardent a proponent of Negro conversion as Cotton Mather look with suspicion on the missionary activities of the SPG. Notwithstanding these formidable difficulties, a number of dedicated missionaries went out to the colonies and did their best to transform the sullen slave into a cheerfully compliant Onesimus. Onesimus. After 1705, when Elias Noy went to the SPG's approval, won the SPG's approval for his previous instruction of slaves in New York, they built schools, visited Negroes in hovels and garrets, taught children to read and to recite Scripture, and remonstrated with stubborn masters. In South Carolina, Brian Hunt suggested that if every 10th Negro were taught to read, the precious skill would soon germinate through the plantation shanties. South Carolinians received this thought with something less than enthusiasm, and the Reverend Hunt despondently returned to England. But despite a law of 1740 which forbade teaching Negroes to write, Alexander Garden, who represented the SPG and Bray's Associates, founded a Negro school at Charlestown, which functioned successfully for 20 years, believing that the children of slaves could transmit literacy and religion to their parents. Garden also employed his earliest pupils to instruct their successors. Occasionally, masters cooperated with these reformers or initiated their own experiments in slave education. Okay, wow. I'm just going to see how much farther we have here. Okay, 6 more pages. The SPG achieved its greatest success in South Carolina, Philadelphia, and New York, where Anglican strength was reinforced by the institutional resources of urban societies. Except for the small-scale activities of the Moravians, the movement to Christianize slaves hardly touched the West Indies, and it languished in Maryland and Virginia. In New England, as we have seen, Cotton Mather warmly endorsed the cause. His morbidly sensitive conscience was responsive to the communal guilt which he knew was in some way involved with Negro slavery. One may note that the witch-seeing girls of Salem had been originally inspired by a Negro servant. Owners of Negroes might become the happy instruments for converting, quote, the blackest instances of blindness and baseness into admirable candidates of eternal blessedness, end quote. Admitting that Africans were, quote, the most brutish of creatures upon earth, end quote, and that they might be the offspring of Ham, Mather was scornful of those who whispered that they lacked rational souls. Since some of Christ's chosen might be found among them, Mather appealed, quote, let us make a trial, whether they that have been scorched and blackened by the sun of Africa may not come to have minds healed by the more benign beams of the sun of righteousness, end quote. Mather was certain that his essay, The Negro Christianized, would enrage the devil, and that he would, quote, immediately be buffeted in some singular manner by that vengeful adversary, end quote. But he was equally confident that national calamities could be prevented if a copy of this pamphlet were placed in every house in New England and the West Indies. Mather named his own Negro boy Onesimus. He was highly incensed when a worldly Navy lieutenant named his slave Cotton Mather, and for some years he maintained a charity school for the religious instruction of Negroes. But hostility to the Church of England prevented New England leaders from cooperating with the SPG. The exclusiveness and decentralized character of congregationalism were obstacles to well-organized missionary effort. Relatively few Negroes were accepted into 18th century New England churches, and those few were often segregated both in worship and burial. Although the Great Awakening gave a slight impetus to the cause of slave conversion throughout the colonies, the zeal of the earlier missionaries did not stimulate an expanding crusade. By the 1760s, a number of Negro schools were still in operation, and the movement initiated by the SPG and Bray's associates had succeeded in bringing perhaps a few thousand Negroes to Christianity and to a rudimentary literacy. It had not, however, laid the foundations for the Christianization of American slavery. I'm just curious. I'm going to go back here and see if one of these notes says what the hell the SPG is, because he keeps mentioning it. And I don't see what it stands for. I may have to look it up, because I don't see that he actually mentions it. Well, alrighty then. He just assumed that everyone forever would know what that stood for. And maybe he mentioned it earlier and then started using the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. I bet you that's what it is. That makes sense. Okay, moving on. In any event, one should not exaggerate the novelty of these efforts, which were so similar in aim with expectation to the programs of Catholic missionaries and to the traditional policies of the Church. British missionaries and philanthropists regarded the Negro slave as a man possessing an immortal soul, but the institution of slavery they accepted without question. In practice, indeed, their labors were designed to impose restrictive controls over the few areas of the Negro's life which remained undisciplined. They pointed with horror at the slaves' irregular sexual lives and at evenings and Sabbaths spent in merrymaking and licentious dancing. Accepting the necessity of forced labor, they strove to make the slaves' leisure time and social relationships conform to the standards of Protestant morality. It is understandable why some Negroes saw little benefit in a religion which sanctioned their master's authority, which enjoined them to avoid idleness and to toil more diligently, and which promised to deprive them of their few pleasures and liberties. Yet one cannot doubt the sincerity or courage of reformers like Francis de Leja and Alexander Garden, who devoted years to the struggle against colonial prejudice and to the often disheartening task of educating and disciplining men of a totally alien culture. The most dramatic failure of the ideology represented by Godwin, Mather, and Bray's associates came with the attempt of the SPG to build two model plantations in Barbados. In 1710, Colonel Christopher Codrington bequeathed the society two Barbadian estates equipped with over 300 Negro slaves. His request that missionaries be sent to live a monastic life on the estates and that a college be founded for the instruction, conversion, and uplift of the Negroes seemed to offer a perfect opportunity to demonstrate that Christianity and slavery were compatible. When West Indian planters saw that Christian slaves on the Codrington plantation were more faithful and diligent than any others, they would realize that their true interest lay in converting their own plantations into model estates where masters and servants would be bound by ties of mutual affection and obligation. Not perhaps since Las Casas experiments in Cumana, Cumana had there been such a vision of building a community where separate races might live together harmoniously in the light of Christian ideals. From the start, however, there were two sobering restraints on such designs for a model slave commonwealth. First, the SPG had no thought of sacrificing the rich profits which the Codrington estates had been earning from the cultivation of sugar. Second, if Barbadian planters were to be shown that slaves could safely be Christianized, it would not do to ignore their prejudices against allowing Negroes undue freedom or privileges. As a result of these practical considerations, the SPG hired agents to manage the estates and decided not to meddle with a profit-making enterprise by imposing unconventional rules and regulations. In 1717, from 1717 to 1726, the SPG failed to make a single convert among its slaves in Barbados. In 1725, the housing for the college had been nearly completed, but financial reverses interrupted the project, and for 20 years the building stood unused. When a school finally did begin to function, it was restricted to white children. Whatever interest the SPG had in the spiritual welfare of its slaves was damped down by the contagious fear of the colonists that literate slaves and public security were irreconcilable. In 1768, the Society's officials in London, who had fallen out of touch with Barbadian affairs, asked the chaplain at Codrington what progress had been made in Negro education. Apparently astonished at such a question, he patiently explained why nothing at all had been done. Like Dutertre, he observed that Negroes were generally perverse and intractable, and that they were really much happier being ignorant. As late as 1793, it was reported that only 3 of the Codrington Negroes could read, and they were elderly and scarcely literate. In the end, it took 120 years for the college, quote unquote college, to begin its assigned work of instructing and converting slaves. But what of the model Christian society which would point the way to a general reform of slavery's worst abuses? The ironies generated by the discrepancy between ideal and reality were perhaps best illustrated in 1732, when a Codrington attorney suggested that the SPG might discourage the practice of branding the chests of newly purchased Negroes with the letters SOCIETY, Society. A few years later, the slaves protested in a group against harsh treatment and excessive labor, an act which resulted in an immediate tightening of discipline. The SPG even failed in its desultory efforts to preserve the Sabbath as a day of rest and worship, since profitable management required a 6-day week of labor, and on Sundays Negroes were accustomed to grow their own provisions and to entertain themselves with dancing and trading. On the subject of marriage, the society remained, as one historian has said, discreetly silent. With the exception of half-hearted moves toward a perfunctory conversion of Negroes, the day-to-day practices of the Codrington plantations were much the same as on less hallowed estates. Instead of providing a model for others to follow, the agents of the SPG conformed to whatever local policies and usages seemed to promise the greatest profits. In the 1760s, however, it was difficult to decide which policies would bring continuing profits. From 1712 to 1761, the Codrington estates had been stocked with some 450 new slaves from Africa. This number had been greatly reduced by disease, suicide, accident, and the usual mortality incident to seasoning. Since males outnumbered females and miscarriages as well as infant deaths were common, the death rate had been more than 6 times greater than the rate of births. The fact that the total population of slaves had declined by about 1/3 in 50 years was damaging both to profits and to the popular image of a happy and well-treated Negro peasantry. After experimenting with hiring slaves from other owners, and with buying a heavily mortgaged estate in order to obtain its seasoned slaves, the managers pondered the economic benefits which might result from encouraging Negro births and from reducing the rate of mortality. It is difficult to see how this search for alternatives to importing slaves from Africa can be pictured as a trend toward amelioration, which would have led inevitably to a kind of humane serfdom. Certainly this was not the case in the United States, where from 1808 to 1860 the slave population increased spectacularly without much benefit from the African trade, and where the burdens of the Negro were not lightened, and if economic pressure led the SPG to abandon its part in the slave trade and to take measures to prolong the lives of its Negroes, one may observe that in 1827, 4 years after the British government had called for the amelioration and eventual end of slavery, Codrington Negroes, including women, were still driven in the fields by whips. No records were kept of their punishments, their marriages were as yet unsanctified, and they could not look forward, even with good behavior, to a possible reward of manumission. Without the mounting pressure of a powerful anti-slavery movement, it is questionable whether the SPG would have been shaken from its easy compromises with the American slave system. But even by 1766, the Codrington plantations were an ideal target for men like Bishop William Warburton, who were beginning to doubt that slavery could be made compatible with Christian duty. We have seen that for 3 centuries both Catholics and Protestants found ways of reconciling their beliefs in natural liberty and limited worldly power to the harsh realities of Negro slavery. There were 2 sides to the conventional rationalization, glossing over the question of the legality of original enslavement, which was partly obscured by a misunderstanding of Africa. Men envisioned the slave trade as a useful instrument for the conversion of pagans, who even as chattel slaves were much better off than their brothers trapped in the dark hell of Africa. But this view of the African side of the system could ultimately be justified only if slavery in America appeared to conform to that happy Christian servitude which had traditionally been seen as a model of the fraternal relationship of unequals. By 1770 it was evident that in the British colonies, at least, hopes for the Christianization of slavery had been ill-founded. When Anthony Benezet denounced the SPG for owning slaves, the Society proudly pointed to its evangelizing efforts in Barbados, only to discover that its claims could not be substantiated. The Society's agents concluded that Negroes could not live meaningful Christian lives unless they had first been civilized, and yet their access to civilization was barred by white colonists who feared that nothing was more dangerous than civilized slaves. It was in the last analysis the Negro's cultural difference that justified his being held as a slave. Paradoxically, the same cultural gap that impeded Christianization and thus weakened the American side of the great rationalization carried implications which would one day undermine the African side. If the Negro could be fitted within the classic framework of primitivism and civilization, which had previously been applied to the American Indian, he would not appear as a pagan rescued from the violence and superstition of a half-civilized barbarism, but as an innocent child of nature ruthlessly seized from his native forests to satisfy the greed of merchants and planters. By the 1760s, quite apart from external influences of anti-slavery thought, there were severe internal strains in the balanced dualisms which for centuries had shaped Christianity's response to slavery. Okay, we are done with that chapter. That takes us to Chapter 8, The Continuing Contradiction of Slavery, a comparison of British America and Latin America, which we will pick up on Sunday. Ooh, excuse me. And it's going to be, wow. There's 9, okay. 262, oh, damn. It is 59 pages long, so it's going to be a long one. I'll probably have to take a break in between, sometime in there. But it's Sunday, so I'll have plenty of time to do that. All right. That is that. So let's. I am not going to start a new game tonight. I am going to be playing Mass Effect 3, but I'm going to start that tomorrow night. So I will see. Well, let's see who is around to raid. God, I've only been gone a week, and I've already forgotten how to do all this. So we've got Happy Jacks RPG playing tabletop RPGs. I don't know what they're playing. Vesper Vidya Retro is playing Crusader Kings 3. Wolf and Narwhal are playing Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom. Um, let's go check out the TTRPG. Um, bear with me just a minute while we head on over there, and I will see you there.